All right, welcome to Anywhere JS. I am Josh Owens, and today we have Jen Luker with us. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you.
Hold on, I'm getting a double feedback. There we go. Okay, so today we're going to talk about accessibility. I'm actually super excited for this talk. I've been a developer for I think 11 or 12 years now. It's been a long time. And I think accessibility was not something I ever dealt with until I got to Kroger. And that seems to be, a much bigger thing for them there. Something that they do tend to focus on. And like I came into it knowing nothing about accessibility. So I think it's like a super important topic. And that's why I asked Jen to give this talk. So I'll leave it to you, Jen.
Thank you. Let's just go ahead and get my screen shared.
There we go. Looks good.
Awesome. All right, so I have actually posted these slides online already. So if you want to follow along for those that are live, you can find them at this link. About me, my name is Jen Luker. I'm currently a lead software engineer at Formidable. You can contact me on Twitter at knitcodemonkey. I'm also at GitHub at knitcodemonkey. And I did mention Formidable. Formidable is a company that not just contracts with your companies and your engineering teams, but is also a consulting team. So we come in and we help you set up a new technology. The technologies we specialize in are React, GraphQL, React Native, Node, and we help you get them set up correctly the first time, and we train your team. So it allows you to get started on the right foot. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk about accessibility. Some of the questions that I'd like to answer today are, what is accessibility? Why should we care? How can we talk to our companies about accessibility? And then a bunch of the tools that different parts of our company can utilize in order to start implementing them in a sprint filler sort of fashion. So what is accessibility? People with disabilities can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with websites and tools, and they can contribute equally without barriers. So when you're talking about accessibility, it's not just being in a wheelchair, it's not just being blind, it's not just being deaf. It's allowing everyone to interact with the web in an understandable and fluid fashion. So when we're talking about disabilities, what exactly does that mean? And I love this quote. When a person is denied access due to a technology barrier, the impairment to their ability did not occur because of their body's limitations. Rather, the defect occurred in the technology. So when you're talking about someone in a wheelchair and they're going into a third floor building and they need to go to that third floor, they wheel into the building and there's only stairs. That is a severe disability. They cannot physically get to where they need to be. Now, if they went into that same building and there was an elevator, they could use the elevator to get to the third floor, and they are no longer inhibited from being able to interact with this building and the people that they need to on the third floor. So disability has less to do with the physical limitations that we have and has more to do with the technologies inhibiting our ability to interact with the world. It's not the fact that a wheelchair-bound person can't use their legs. It's whether there's an elevator available that can make them as efficient as the rest of us that do have legs that work. So there are quite a few different types of disabilities, but I like to categorize them down into these three different formats. You have a permanent disability, which would be an actual vision deficiency or a hearing deficiency or a broken or a missing limb, something to that effect. You also have a temporary disability, something like a broken limb, or your eye, your eyes have been surgically worked on, so they're currently not working. You have quite a few different possibilities for temporary disabilities. You then also have circumstantial disabilities. So this is something that isn't just like a physical limitation or a mental limitation. This is just something that means that you're in the wrong place at the wrong time to utilize these technologies. So for instance, you're in a really loud bar and you want to watch a video, or your eyes were just dilated, or you're holding a baby and therefore your mouse hand is currently in use and you do not want to wake this child up. So disabilities isn't always a permanent situation. It can be something that you can heal from, like a temporary disability, or a circumstantial disability where it's a situational disability. I would like to say 90% of your day is dictated by technology. And if you as a person are not included in that technology, what is the point if the app is fast? So when thinking about this, when you're looking at your web applications or your mobile applications that you're programming, if someone can't use it, why does it matter if it's fast or efficient or user-friendly? They can't use it at all. So when we're talking about humans, we know that it's the right thing to put accessibility into our websites. We know that there are lots of different possibilities for putting accessibility into our projects. But the business isn't a person. So when you're trying to convince your business that it's time to implement accessibility features, how does one do that? Let's talk about stats. At any given time, 20% of the population, between 19 and 20, depending on what you look at, qualifies as permanently, temporarily, or circumstantially disabled. So with 20% more engagement, you have the opportunity to make 20% more money. So according to World Health Organization and the US censuses, it's about 1 in 5, about 20% of the people have a disability. They identify as having a disability. Those are permanent disabilities. That doesn't include the temporary or circumstantial disabilities. But not all disabilities are going to apply when you're talking about a website. So we kind of balance it out by saying it's still about 20% once you take into account the people that are currently dealing with a broken arm or currently sitting in a noisy bar and want to watch a video. So if you're taking your user base and you're adding approximately 20% to that user base, that is a lot more money that you could be that you could be bringing in. That takes a $10 million company and turns it into a $12 million company just by implementing some accessibility features into your website. That's a really big deal. I mean, I don't know of very many features, individual feature work that you can implement that has that much of an improvement on your possible engagement. But wait, there's more. The ramp outside of our local public library makes the building more easily accessible to those using wheelchairs, but also to the parent with a sleeping baby, the cyclist, or the delivery driver with a dolly full of packages. By implementing these accessibility features, by making our website more easily usable, by isolating a lot of the complexity and making it much easier to use, we're not just reaching the people that actually use assistive technologies like screen readers. We're helping every person that uses your website. Fewer people are going to get frustrated and leave. Fewer people are going to get lost and leave. A lot more people are going to make it through your funnel. So not only are you gaining the 20% of the people that you couldn't reach before, you're gaining the 100% of the people that you're currently assisting already. that improves that percentage a lot more than just 20%. So when you're talking to a business and you're talking about money and you're talking about feature sets and you're talking about improved engagement, this is why accessibility is so important. Because you're increasing your user base. You're increasing the number of people that can make it through the funnel, not just through disability, but through accessibility. So fine, you're ready to get started. Let's talk about some of the tools that you can use. Now, the very first one that I absolutely adore are the Axe extensions. And I want to show you those for just a moment. So when we're talking about the Axe Chrome extension, let's go to once you've installed the Axe Chrome extension, you have an Axe option over here. By analyzing your website, you can see the issues that it's found. Page must contain one main landmark. Content should be contained in a landmark region. Elements must have sufficient color contrast. And it can show you where that element is. And it can even highlight it for you on the page, perhaps. But it also gives you a lot more information. It shows you where this element is, and it gives you options for how you can solve this violation. And it even gives you an impact rating and a learn more button that will take you into the application and explain what this feature is and why you can, what you need to do to update it, and then why it's important. So it does in fact give you a lot more information regarding those different features. There are also design tools that can be utilized. For instance, the WebAIM color contrast checker is a really great one. What it does is it allows you to compare different technology or different colors based on your foreground and background and give you that contrast ratio. Now, if your contrast is too low, you can see that it starts failing these tests. So by just a simple addition and comparison, you can see whether the contrast that you have are passing or failing different accessibility feature tests. You also have the Toptal Colorblind web page filter, which is quite interesting, in that it can show you what a page looks like normally and what it looks like with different types of color blindness. It shows you, the red-green color blindness, the blue-yellow color blindness, and it even shows you the grayscale. So you can start to see what the color contrasts are going to do for your website. In the end, regardless of what you do, color contrast is the most important thing to keep in mind. If you look at these color contrasts, you notice that these look pretty different to each of us. However, if you're suffering from, the grayscale type of color deficiency, they look almost the same. It can be very difficult to tell these colors apart. So being aware of those different color blindness filters will allow you to reach a much larger portion of the population. By, on average, 8% of men and about 0.5% of women suffer from color blindness. So you're looking at about 4.5% of the population. that you're reaching just by including some of those features. And those features are simply making sure that they can identify what the text is on a button, or if you're looking at a block of text, identifying where the links are within that block of text. So some development tools that we have React A11y. We also have the ESLint plugin JSX A11y and Xcore. So to talk a little bit about these, the ESLint plugin allows you to identify HTML within your build process while it's linting to prevent you from making some accessibility mistakes. Some of those would be not putting alt tags or requiring role tags on certain items. The Xcore is it's a project by DQ Labs that you can implement into your automated testing to allow you to basically check accessibility, those same accessibility features through your automated tests. So once we start looking at our websites and we start testing using those various tools, we notice that there's really a lot of stuff that we could be fixing. And a lot of times those can seem really overwhelming. So what do we do to realistically break those down? There are a few very cool checklists that can help you with these things. I really like the one from Ally Project. It gives you a literal checklist of items that you can just mark off as you go. It also breaks it down by links or JavaScript things you can do or media testing for colorblindness. But it does give you a place to start. This isn't a comprehensive list of items, but it does give you some place to start. You also have available another checklist which goes into a lot more detail. From Elsevier. It gives you the level of compliance and information regarding each and every item on that list. It gives you much more detail. It even has a link directly to the rule that gives you this requirement. You can also filter it down, just like you could with the other one. This is just much more comprehensive. So once you've done some of the initial items, it can be really helpful to go through and look at this list to see some of the more details. It's also very educational. Something that you might be interested in aware of is Section 508 is actual legal compliance for the United States websites. This is oftentimes what is stated when someone refers to accessibility on the web. So when you're getting started, the things that I recommend is starting with your definition of done with your projects. If you as a dev have started to implement the linters and you've got Xcore, you can test your own items and refuse to pass it on to QA until those are passing. That gives you as a developer a comfortable understanding that you've done everything that you can do before you pass it on. You know, if you have an automation engineer on your team or on the QA team, they can incorporate the X tools into testing. If not, then you can do the same thing. You can incorporate the Xcore engine into your automated tests. Xcore has got a lovely website, which I've linked in my slides before, to give you kind of step-by-step information and code examples for how you can incorporate those into your automated testing. And again, that allows you to be relatively confident that you've covered a lot of the technology side of information. When design is starting to develop websites, when design is checking it, some of the things they need to make sure they check for is color contrast, font sizes, make sure that they're aware of how the web is going to interact with that website, how screen readers are going to interact, so they can get that understanding of the motion and the movement throughout a website. Now, once you've incorporated those things into your definition of done, that means that things from here on out are going to be good. There's no point in going back if you're not moving forward. So start with what you're doing today and don't worry about things that are happening before. And once that's been incorporated and your definition of done is relatively solid, you can move on to existing reusable components, the things that you're implementing in multiple places. And those things that you're creating, the components that you're reusing are really not reusable if they're not accessible. At that point, all you're doing is duplicating inaccessibility and allowing those things to be populated through your website and potentially other websites if people are mimicking those similar formats. The benefit of going through and fixing these reusable components and making them accessible is that when you fix them in the core location, you're fixing them for every version of its reuse. Fixing it once really does fix it almost everywhere. Once those are done, we can do an audit by page or by template, however you lay out your websites, and look at the one-off customizations that have been made that are going to make your site a little bit more inaccessible. Now, something to keep in mind with accessibility is when you're looking at Axe Core or you're looking at the Axe and the Axe extensions, or you're looking at automated testing, you're only catching about 30% of what's actually accessibility. Those things can check technology, they can check your implementations. What they cannot check is the content. If your content is difficult to read, you are cutting off people that are less patient, perhaps suffer from something like ADHD or another mental deficiency. You got to go through and actually look at your website. You need to make sure that the interactions between your components are reusable, that the words that you're using are clear and direct the user towards the important bits of information. That takes a lot more work. That takes a lot more interaction with the rest of the team, but it is still a very important part. But by this point, we've made sure that the technology is accessible. So now it's time to look at the actual implementation. So there's a lot of information there. A lot of it is linked, so you can go find it again. And a lot of it is relatively generic, starting with your definition of done or go implement an Axe Core test. But I wanted to show you a little bit in action. So what we're looking for in this example is the common thing you'll see on Twitter or that you've heard in other talks that says, use a button, not a link, or use a button, not a div. Use a button, not a link, use a link, not a button. And this kind of gives you a little bit more of that definition. So buttons interact with the current page. They're actions. Links take you off the page and go to somewhere else. They're navigation. Divs are just not accessible. Now, that's not necessarily true because we have things like ARIA rules that allow us to make divs accessible. But I really wanted to show you that example. So here's a button. And here's a code for a button. So here's our body. We have our button. We have text. So when you click on this button, it shows this text. This is the JavaScript that allows us to toggle this button so we can open it and click on it again to close it. You can also tab to it. You can hit enter. You can hit space. You can tab off of it. It has that interaction. And we can do the same thing with a div. And oftentimes the reason for utilizing a div is because we want this to not look like a button. So let's just go ahead and add the class of not button. And all it does is remove the border of the background, and it makes a display block like most divs are. And by refreshing, it looks like a div now. You can still tab to it. You can still hit enter. You can still hit space. It does all the things that a button used to do. It just looks like a div. So now let's look at this div. This div is right here. You can click on it. I've added some things. So we have the roll of button. We've forced it to have a tab index of 0. There's our content. So when you click on it, you can still see that content. But if you notice, there's a lot more JavaScript down here as well. So we have the toggle div. But in order for this to be accessed correctly on both click and key press, you actually have to bind both of those events. And you add listeners, and you have to make them very specific to those div IDs, or however way you decide to select it. And then we need to check and make sure that we're either using an enter or we're using a space for these event keys. We also need to prevent default so this doesn't click when the page reloads. And then we eventually toggle that div. What's also interesting is to make this a button, look like a button, you have to add a few extra features on the CSS. So, you're setting your background to make it look like a button. You're also setting your border. You're adding some padding. You're making it inline block so it acts like a button. And then you can tab to it because you've set tab index. You can enter because we designated enter here. You can hit space because we designated the enter and the space key, and that we checked for click and key press. This is interesting though, cursor pointer. Now, of course, you want it to look like a button and that when you hover over it, it looks like a pointer that you'd see on a standard button, but this has an extra feature. If you do not add cursor pointer, iPhones will not actually detect this as a clickable item, even though everything else says it's clickable. So if you don't add cursor pointer, you will not be able to click on it on an iPhone. So when looking at these two again, we have about 36 lines, and that includes the head and the HTML and a couple CSS things. But essentially, you've got a button, and the only thing we've done is added a value of button. On here, we needed to add a roll of button. We had to add a tab index. We needed to make sure that we identified the add event listeners. We had to make sure that we checked which keys we were pressing when we clicked on it. We had to prevent the default to make it work. This is just for one button. So now let's look at a drop-down checkbox. I've made this work with just a button, with a div, and checkboxes. This is not very pretty. It hasn't been polished, but I do want to show you something else. This is one that has been polished, and it is very pretty. It says none selected. You can choose items, and it changes the names. We could do that with ours, not very difficult. It does some highlighting. It looks really pretty. But let's look at my example again. It looks like it has a bit more code, a little bit of CSS. That's all of our JavaScript right now. In this example, it looks like it has a little bit less as far as HTML goes. It's got a fair amount of CSS, and it's already been minimized. And the JS goes on and on and on and on and on and on, and continues to go. And we're still scrolling. That's what it takes to make a div in a drop-down checkbox selection, a multi-select, accessible. So when we're talking about a button, not a div, that is the simplest thing we can think of. But what we're really looking at here is the more complex we design our elements, the further away we get from default HTML, the less we get for free. And the more we have to enter in binding handlers and ARIA roles, the more complex it gets. The benefit of using default HTML as often as possible before adding JavaScript, before adding CSS, is that you get a lot of the accessibility features for free. So when you hear someone say, use a button, not a div, this is what they're talking about. Accessibility isn't for just a select few, it's for everybody. And it is for you. And that is my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. That was really good.
Thank you. Hopefully there have been some questions that we can answer.
Yes, a couple. And then I actually have a couple myself as well.
Cool.
We continually have that argument of button versus link because our designers want buttons in some spots and things that look like links in other spots. And we have this argument all the time at work. So it's quite funny you went into it. Andreas actually said ARIA roles are the last resort to give something semantic meaning to an element like a div, isn't it? So it might be best to use proper HTML5 elements.
Absolutely. Again, using those default HTML elements gives you a lot of that for free. The first rule of ARIA is do not use ARIA. If you can possibly avoid it, don't use it. Go for a default generic HTML solution first. Those are for additional features, additional things that you have to do that you can't make accessible simply by using HTML. One of the biggest examples is a drop-down menu. We don't currently have any default HTML ways of making drop-down menus. We almost always end up using unordered lists with links, and then there's sub-unordered lists with links, and navigating through those can get really complicated, and that's where ARIA roles really start to show their beauty. But if you can avoid using them, definitely do.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree too. Like seeing the tab index on there also kind of like got my heckles up, I guess, because it feels like, you know, if you want, like when someone default like tabs through the interface, they're really looking for actionable things. And so the fact that like you've put a tab index on there to make sure that it gets in there tells you you're probably like using the wrong type of element to me.
Usually. However, things like drop-down menus, they are really important to use. You want to make sure the drop-down elements are not detectable until you open up their parent element. So in those senses, even using a tab index has its purpose. But again, it's like ARIA rules. You know, they're there when you need them, but try to avoid them if you can.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember like early on for me, they wanted like descriptions to be read out by the screen reader as someone was tabbing through. And so we were like forcibly putting tab index on like paragraph tags. And that felt, you know, at the end of the day, like we actually have someone that reviews all our accessibility stuff before it gets shipped. And he dinged us on that because it was like, you know, that's not what a user is expecting, which I guess leads to my next question. For projects that you work on, have you guys ever sat with someone who's disabled and like watched them use something like JAWS or yeah, I guess that's the question.
I absolutely have, actually. So I have an added benefit that my mother is deaf. My sister was both deaf and blind. It was a little bit before the internet at the time, but it was interesting having that interaction with her. Now, referring to people that use these tools on a regular basis, it's their way of actually interacting with the web. I have, in fact, sat down and had some good conversations, and I still do have some resources for people that will do that for me. There are actually very fruitful roles for those that go into that line of work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was a bit eye-opening for us. We had a user come in and like sit down and they recorded the whole session with him walking through a website and kind of showing how things were working. And we actually got a lot out of that. Like, oh, we need to go fix some stuff, right? Because like
Mm-hmm.
we use Aria Live to update, like when you add something to your cart, it like updates the total and how many items in your cart. And it turned out like everything, there were like 4 things marked with Aria Live, and like on Jaws, it just like all tried to speak at once, and like you just get this weird mashup of like, you added something to your cart for, um, you now have 599 items, and it was like, what is that? Like that's weird. So it took us a while to fix that, but it was definitely interesting to see like what you mentioned a little bit about, like testing with Axe and um, what do you guys like hand test stuff as well? And do you use like Jaws, or there's like Chromevox, and there's other options out there? Like how do you decide how you're going to approach like hand testing, I guess, and make sure everything looks good?
The answer is yes. You use them all. So when you're talking again about that definition of done,
Mhm.
you shouldn't be the only one that's using the screen readers as well as just keyboard implementation or just mouse interaction to try to get through a website. Though you should absolutely be using those. I mean, like I said, Axe only detects the technology. So they make sure that the roles are there. They make sure that the elements themselves have been implemented correctly, but they don't test the interaction between those elements. They don't test the text that you're seeing. They don't test the readability. So you absolutely need to go through and identify those things manually to make sure that what you're seeing and how you're interacting works the way that you expect it to. And you cannot do that if you can still see your monitor.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Someone, I think you and I had a chat on Twitter actually about like what are like the most popular tools, or like how do you decide what you're going to test in, and like you sent me a survey which was pretty cool, and I passed that around our office. But to me it's a little frustrating that we don't get any kind of like stats. Like someone, you can come to me and be like, how many people are on a mobile phone, and like what's the like common browser we're seeing like 80% usage of, and like we don't have those stats for accessibility tools. Like we don't know if someone has like, are they on their iPhone? Do they have the accessibility features turned on there, or are they like using Jaws or something else? Like we don't really get those kinds of reports. Like, have you had any conversations around that before besides me?
Yeah, actually, yes. So, one of the biggest reasons why you don't get those stats is a violation of HIPAA laws. The truth of the matter is that showing you and everyone that has access to the internet that you are using those is actually a violation. It shows that you potentially have a medical condition that prevents you from being able to interact in that certain way. So by exposing that to the user, you're letting everybody know that you have a medical condition. So at that point, based on HIPAA laws, you'd have to get confirmation from every place that you verified. Yes, they have permission to look at my entire medical record in order to show that they have this medical condition and how to react with it. So based on privacy laws, based on medical privacy laws, those things cannot be exposed.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I did think about that the other day as I was kind of trying to get an idea of questions together for this. And I like there's really no good way around that either. Like I wish there were a way that we could get some kind of like aggregate statistics without like singling out an individual browser, but it just seems like there's not a great way. And the stuff you link to is more like voluntary surveys that people are filling out, and then we
Mm-hmm.
kind of base the information off of that. And it seems like the majority of people do seem to rely on Jaws.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jaws is the screen reader for Windows.
Mm-hmm.
So
And it's based on solely IE, right? Is that true? Or does
Yeah,
it work for Edge?
I believe it works for Edge as well.
Okay.
So it's just the screen reader for Windows systems.
Awesome. Yeah, someone pointed, Aaron Doyle just said WebAIM does some good surveys and presents their results, which is, that's what you linked me to.
It was.
Pretty awesome. But again, you know, it's like, are we truly seeing the right info there? Like we're definitely getting info from people that are seeing the survey, but that doesn't mean like there's definitely room for error there.
There's always going to be room for error, but the questions that you're asking are pointing much more towards, is it actually worth it for us to implement these features when we have other features? Is there really a purpose to implementing a screen reader if what you're selling is rainbows? So, and the question that I want to pose you is, do you believe that people with a color deficiency don't see rainbows? Or do they just see them differently?
Yeah.
And what
that's a good
about
point.
blind, fully blind people? Does everyone they know also suffer from full blindness? Or do they maybe have a niece that likes rainbows?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting to think about.
So though the features that you may have may not seem to affect your primary base of people, that doesn't mean that it doesn't help someone. There's also varying degrees of colorblindness. There are people that are only slightly colorblind, that they have a limited number of cones in order to see a color, but they're not completely missing. You also have people with like learning disabilities that are trying to navigate through your site. There's a lot of different ways that you can increase accessibility features or the usability of your site. One little tiny efficiency at a time. Like if you're looking at images, just add an alt tag. Give it some description. Eventually, you need to go in and look at the description and see if those tags themselves actually identify why they should care specifically about what this picture says. But at least add the alt tag, because then it's available. Make sure that your contrast is high enough that even people that are just not blind and not colorblind, but have poor vision in general, like the elderly, can look at this thing and actually see that there's a link there, that the contrast is high enough that they can read the text. So even if you're adding just one little element at a time, you're improving the usability of your site. So in the end, there's no such thing as disabilities don't apply to me. They don't apply to my website. They don't apply to what I'm working on. Now, you do need to prioritize and say, well, these features are more important to me than others, but that doesn't mean that people with the ones that you're ignoring don't still exist.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all that. And it's just so eye-opening to me, again, to like sit down with someone and watch them actually do it, and you're just like, wow, that's a terrible experience. Like I feel bad that I didn't make it better ahead of time. Like I didn't have the knowledge, but it's like, it's one of those things that's definitely within our power. If we put the time and effort in, we can make a better experience for a lot of people that, struggle with how things are working. And you just don't even realize it. Like we thought, like my first days on a team, we started using Chromebox, and we're like, okay, well, this like gives us a good enough kind of view of what it looks like and how it should work. And then it turns out like we opened it with JAWS, and it was super terrible. Like Chromebox was fine and JAWS wasn't, and the majority of people use JAWS.
So what you're dealing with here is more browser wars, just accessible technology wars. So the issue with development is that each one interacts differently. So when you're looking at JAWS, it does have one way of going through, whereas Chromebox has another. And then if you're looking at your phone, you've got a whole different way of interacting with a website than you would if you were on a desktop. So the gestures required where you can click on headlines or titles or boxes gets really quickly confusing if you're not using it on a regular basis, which is one of the reasons that we all should be testing all of our stuff with screen readers. Not just because we need to make sure that they function, but because we need to become familiar with them as well. We won't be able to accurately identify whether there's a problem if we're not familiar with the technology that we're coding for.
Yeah. Another question, like you mentioned briefly that you are perhaps using Axe in an automated fashion to test your web apps. Have you looked at anything else, or is that primarily like what you utilize, like in a pipeline testing kind of way?
There's a variety of testing resources that you can use. Like I said, one of them is a linter, so you can check it before you even get to automated testing. I do use Axe Core for the automated testing for a couple of different reasons. One of them is they strive for no false positives. So the purpose is that if it actually dings, it's an important thing. They've actually identified this is a really real thing. It's not just something that might possibly be. So that's one of my benefits to utilizing Xcore. There are others that are a little bit more aggressive. They take a little bit more time to go through and navigate which ones are actually issues, which ones are not. But when you're talking about like larger companies, you really need to make sure that what you're testing for is in fact a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you used Lighthouse at all?
Absolutely. I love Lighthouse.
Yeah.
Lighthouse also uses Xcore actually for its accessibility testing.
Yeah. We actually just wrapped up probably about a month and a half ago, a feature where we got Lighthouse into our pipeline. The majority of like the pages that I deal with are behind like a login. And so I used Puppeteer to open a browser and log in, and then use Lighthouse to connect to that running instance of Puppeteer, and then it like gets the report for the page and gives us feedback on the accessibility, obviously from the Axe Core tool, which is nice. And then we got the added benefit of actually seeing performance, and now we're trying to clean that up at the same time. But have you ever used something like Tenon? I think is what it's called, Tenon.io. No,
I haven't.
I think it looks interesting. We haven't had a chance to play with it yet, but you ship it some HTML, and then it'll run something similar to Axe Core, and then it'll come back and like you can use it in a more automated fashion, like in Jest testing or something like that, and it'll fail out from there. The thing that I struggle with a little bit with Just Axe is that a lot of times you're just using it with Enzyme or something of that nature, and you're just getting like a small view of the HTML, and I feel like you can't catch a lot of the accessibility problems when you're just looking at like one little snippet of HTML.
Well, that's if you're utilizing it for that isolated, more unit test fashion. You can still use Jest and Enzyme to test an entire web page and to be able to identify all of the elements within that web page.
Yeah.
So at that point, you're just rendering the entire page and then using the same test against the entire page to identify interacting issues there.
Yeah.
So it's actually how I'm using it now.
Nice. All right. So Aaron Fox asked, are there any good tips, links, articles for mobile apps in accessibility?
Oh, goodness. Yes. Lots and lots. So mobile apps. I guess there's a couple different ways of approaching mobile apps. One of them, are you referring to actually using native or React Native to add accessibility features, or are you talking about PWAs where you're looking at a website on a mobile application? There's different ways of looking at that. So when you're referring to looking at your mobile apps or your mobile websites, you can use all the same tools. You're still using, you're still using Axe Core, you're still using Axe to identify those features. In fact, Lighthouse uses the Axe Core to test the mobile version in order to identify the problems within the mobile version, that need to be fixed there. So that is a great one. If you're talking about accessibility features within React Native, there's actually a great document within the React Native documentation on accessibility features and how to utilize them and some of the pitfalls and when you need to use each one. So the React Native documentation is actually really good there. I'm giving a talk in about a week and a half on being a React Native ally. So stay tuned for that one. There'll be quite a few details and resources that I'll be displaying there. A great one is to find a cheat sheet for utilizing the screen readers on both Android and iPhone. They are not as intuitive as you would think. They don't have a tab key. They don't have a mouse. So everything is done with touch and gestures. So I highly recommend you turn on your screen readers there and do it when you've got the sheet next to you, because it is definitely a learning curve when you first start. And I'll definitely post those probably on Twitter.
Yeah, if you get those up on Twitter, I'll make sure to put them in the YouTube comments as well, or maybe in the description, so people can get access to those links. All right, I think that was all the questions we had. Thank you, Jen, and I really appreciate you giving this talk.
Thank you.
All right. So in 2 weeks, we will have another talk. It will be about Vue.js and kind of how to get started with it, and like building quick, like 5-minute apps with it. So be sure to go to anywherejs.com and you can catch more info about that next talk in 2 weeks. Thanks. Bye.